Yeah, it's good to be here. It's good to be back in Penn State. This is a lot of these very familiar campus. Even this room is familiar. I used to be here roughly once a week. The Penn State student organization, Penn State Christian Grads, would have their weekly meeting in here, and I would maybe semi-regularly attend that. And I'd also, especially towards the later years, I was also involved with the Happy Valley Christian community. And so, thanks to Ernest, thanks to Sean, Kathy, all the rest for putting up, organizing this event. I was a graduate student here in the Department of Plant Pathology and Environmental Microbiology, and it's in the College of Agriculture. And that was the bulk of my work, for sure. I mean, that was all of my work, really. But I do have interests outside of that, as you could sort of gather, coming here to the Penn State Christian Grads, Happy Valley, and so on. Sciences, but also, like philosophy, religious faith, and how these interlock with each other. So here at Penn State, I was in a PhD program. So PhD is really, I mean, it's kind of its own word now, but it's an abbreviation for the Latin phase of a philosophy doctor, or like a doctor of philosophy. So specifically, I would have been working towards a doctorate in philosophy in plant disease. And there's a lot of other graduate students here working towards their PhDs, their doctorate of philosophies in many specialties, soil science, plant science, the engineerings, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, biomedical engineering, physics, math, so on and so forth, on and on. So they're really quite, these graduate degrees are often very, very specialized, like hyper-specialized almost. But it wasn't always like this for higher education. At least 2 centuries or so ago, a doctoral student might have studied what they called a natural philosophy. So it would have considered what we consider to be philosophy today, just the philosophers, but also what we consider the sciences, the study of the natural world, and so on. But since then, the PhD programs have gotten ever more specialized, and it seems to just keep going in that direction. And there's more and more focus, I think, on the details of each particular science field, and sort of less and less on the philosophy that the science that takes the philosophy within the science. It's not to say that there was no philosophy in my studies. It was there, but it was mostly just implicit. It wasn't really discussed much. This is just how we do things. The closest I probably got to studying philosophy is we had a 1-credit professional development in ethics class that touched on ethical and some philosophical topics. But it was a 1-credit course where our normal courses would have been 3 or 4 credits. So it just kind of scratched the surface. And I do remember kind of enjoying that class. I do remember most of the students did not enjoy it. They just wanted to get back to the real science. And I think that's kind of typical of sciences. The scientists just want to get into the details, dig into the details of their work. And to some extent, I think it's true of. To some extent, it's almost true of humans in general. We spend most of our time with the fine little details, less so on the bigger picture. So, I mean, there's within science, there's some good reasons for not focusing that much on science, because it's so much work just to make a dissertation in whatever your specific field is, that you don't really have time for much else. And the topic of the philosophy of science is so big, you could easily do a PhD just in that alone. So there's some practical limitations there. So the big picture view, the big picture philosophical picture, the big picture view, the bigger philosophical picture within science, and I think within the practice, the education of science and so on is just more implicit. It's more assumed. It's just not discussed much. And so I have to think about the story about the 2 fish pass each other in the water, and the old fish says to the young fish, "How's the water?" And the young fish says, well, what's water? You know, if it's so much part of your environment, you don't even think about it. And I think that's how it is about the philosophical assumptions that of the society we live in. Many of them, it's just, well, that's just the way it is. We don't even think that other things could be possible. So a bit more on some of my sources for this talk, or I should say, not sources, but things that have influenced me. I had an interest in the bigger picture as well, even though my studies were in the details. In between, I found some time to read books on the bigger picture before my college education, during and after. So just so you know a little bit of where I'm coming from, some of the books that have influenced me. So I grew up in a Christian home. Some of the books, Christian books like Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, you know, Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton, and then also books on other non-Christian viewpoints like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, and, you know, A Letter to a Christian Nation, and Waking Up: How to Have Spirituality Without Religion by Sam Harris. I had an English translation of the Quran, which is hard to read, actually. There's a book called Misquoting Muhammad, The Challenge and Choices of Interpreting the Prophet's Legacy by Jonathan Brown. That was actually one that I was in the hub, and the Muslim Student Association was handing out these books. So I was like, oh, well, I never turned down a free book, of course. So I grabbed one and read it, and it was interesting for sure. There's the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. It's a Chinese, like Confucianism, somewhat. There was a visiting Chinese scholar, and we were talking about religion and sort of philosophy and so on, and he mentioned that as sort of where he's landed at. And so I bought the book to figure out where that is, and yeah. And I mean, those books are all interesting in various ways. I really kind of enjoy the books that draw a big picture view of history, to kind of draw these threads through history and show how you know the ideas, basically show how we got to where we are today. You know, how did these ideas develop? And you know, there's a bookstore down in Gettysburg. I just kind of randomly bought Francis Schaeffer's book, How Shall We Then Live? And that was kind of one of those types of books, especially about art and other things as well. And then during my PhD study, hopefully I'm not totally boring everyone out with all these book names, but there was a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And it's a book that could well be very boring to someone who's not in the sciences, but I had been in the sciences for a number of years already, and so it was kind of like a blast of fresh air. And that kind of just fed my curiosity in the bigger picture of science. And then other books I've read in the same line include like The Soul of Science, Christian Faith and Natural Philosophy, and History and Eschatology, Jesus and the Promise of Natural Theology. That's more not so much science as just the bigger question of how do we know what we know along those lines, and Penultimate Curiosity, How Science Swims in the Slipstream of the Ultimate Questions. So anyway, that's hopefully a fast, hopefully not too long overview of some of the influences and my experiences. Of course, those are some of the books I read, experiences being a graduate student, taking classes, talking with professors and students and so on. That of course was influential for me as well as my my home community, home church, and so on. Some people have the idea that if you're in college or if you're a graduate student, you're probably this super intellectual person, and it's not necessarily the case at all. I've had some really deep intellectual discussions with friends who never went to college, and there's some graduate students here who are just so focused on the little details, and they don't even want to talk about big picture stuff. So anyway, I've all the conversations I've had have influenced me. So I'm going to try and draw my experiences in the books and everything to try and answer the question that I pose in the theme of my talk, which is, well, my title of my talk, Faith, Philosophy, and the Emergence of Modern Science. And the questions is, so why did modern science, as we know it, arise out of Western Europe and not somewhere else, and what theological and philosophical worldviews contributed to its rise, to the rise of science, and are arguably essential to its survival. And to try and answer these questions, I want to go through a very brief historical overview of the history of science, and especially looking at the frameworks within which, the philosophical frameworks within which science developed, and try and answer the question of how did we get here? With the idea, of course, if we have an idea of how we got here, that should give us an indicator of where we're going. So part of the problem, part of the fascination with talking about history is that history is rather messy. And our knowledge of history is incomplete. We don't know everything that happened in the past. So it is quite tempting to draw this nice straight line, like we started here, we ended up here, there you go. When in reality, it's a lot more of twists and turns and stops and starts and so on. So hopefully I don't oversimplify things, but even with the sort of the messiness of history, there's definitely certain threads that you can trace through the history that can inform our understanding of the present. Yeah, and also, what I'm presenting is by no means the final word on this subject. This is just my experiences, my thoughts, at the end there'll be time for a questions discussion. So if it doesn't make sense, maybe it just doesn't make sense. Maybe that's exactly what it is. This is something I'm quite fascinated about. So the two books that I'm drawing on most heavily for this part of the talk is The Soul of Science by Piercy and Thaxton, and The Penultimate Curiosity by Wagner and Briggs. And they both say similar things, but broadly speaking, the history of science includes some ideas from Greek philosophy, and then those from the Abrahamic faiths of like Judaism, Islam, Christianity. And there are influences from other cultures as well, but the strongest influences are from Greek philosophy and the Abrahamic faiths. So this is something Wagner and Briggs in particular, they show how the ideas that developed into science, trace it through the Greek philosophers, and they mentioned 400-500 years before Christ, there were these philosophers, Greek philosophers, that even they even preceded the more well-known figures of Plato and Socrates, and they just pushed the going or sort of the common understanding of the world in that time were that anything, or one of the more common understandings, there was always a number of different opinions, but anything that happened to the natural world could be attributed directly to the actions of one or another god. So like earthquakes were caused by Poseidon shaking the ground, lightning bolts were thrown by Zeus, the sun was Helios driving his horse and chariot across the sky, and so on. And some of these philosophers developed the idea that instead of these natural phenomena being the actions of these gods, there was a divine force, like a divine arche that they called, that was the origin of all things and that encompassed all things and directed all things. And they varied quite widely in their opinions of how this exactly plays itself out in the world we live in. But there was a philosophical shift in that they started to look for more mechanical models to explain nature instead of just directly attributing everything to the gods. And this did create a bit of a stir. Wagner and Briggs, they mentioned that in Athens there was this philosopher that was condemned for impiety because he declared the sun to be a mass of red-hot metal. That was impious. Like the sun is to be worshipped, not figured out, And then he was forced to leave Athens. So this is just some of the thoughts that were going, some of the ideas that were stirring around in ancient Greece. And they mentioned Socrates was strongly influenced by these ideas, but he also wanted to search for a reliable basis for moral actions, not just physical actions in the physical world, but morally. And Stephen mentioned Socrates as described by Plato, how he came. Some of his ideas were getting close to what we believe in, or what Jesus presented later on. But he had an ethical position, again as described by Plato, that it was better to suffer evil than to do it, and that one should not return evil for evil. And there's a quote about Justin Martyr, one of the first century convert. He was a philosopher converted to Christianity. Although interestingly enough, supposedly he always wore his philosopher gown even after his conversion, as an indicator that he hadn't turned away from philosophy, but that he had now found the true philosophy, the true wisdom. But anyway, he just, in some ways he describes Socrates almost like a Christian before Christ. So whatever you want to do with that, but that's. They had ideas. The philosophers came up with ideas similar to, or at least in the direction of where Christianity and Judaism were. So Socrates was not really a scientist, but he had these ideas on the moral and physical order of the world that then provided a space within which science could develop. And there were these philosophers like Plato. Without getting into too much details, and I haven't studied this in great detail either, but Plato had the idea that there were these forms, these perfect forms, and numbers were the closest thing to the forms, and he emphasized mathematics and geometry, and he tried to. In some ways, he had the first program of scientific research, started kind of using math and geometry to explain the natural world, like astronomy and so on. And there were other very influential, you might call them early scientists, philosophers. Aristotle would have been in there for sure, Ptolemy, Galen, and others. But it seemed it didn't really build much on those early Greek, very influential Greek. It almost seemed like, at least for hundreds of years, people just sort of accepted what they said, or maybe not completely accepted, but they didn't really build on that to keep building. And Wagner and Briggs specifically say that it was because of the religion that they had at the time. So some of the more common religions were like Stoicism, if you want to call it a religion or philosophical view, Stoicism, Epicureanism. And they say those were not so much concerned with knowledge, but with what they called peace of mind or apatheia. And there were some like Democritus, if I'm saying that right. He was the one who taught that everything is made up of atoms, which are the smallest indivisible things, and that's basically all there is, like a totally materialistic way. You might say atheistic. But the reason they did this was to get rid of the fear of the gods, the fear of judgment after death, the fear of bad things. It's just the physical world. You don't need to be terrified about all the spiritual stuff. This is all there is. But it seemed that beyond sort of getting rid of the fear, they had no real reason to keep studying nature. They actually had some of their writings. They talked about that research is futile if it does not contribute to peace of mind. So that was kind of the goal. That was it didn't really contribute to the continuation of knowledge. And then moving on to the early Christians, they definitely appreciated the Greek philosophers. And again, as Stephen mentioned, there's definitely some differences of opinion within the early Christian writings about how much they appreciated them. Some of the stuff is these early Christian writings is depending on who would hear it, it's borderline scandalous to some of us today, perhaps. But like Justin Martyr, we have been taught that Christ is the firstborn of God, and we have declared above that he is the word of whom every race of men were partakers, and those who lived reasonably are Christians, even though they have been thought atheists. as among the Greeks, Socrates and Herculitus and men like them. So, yeah. Anyway, they appreciated the Greek philosophers. You can kind of leave it at that. There were some who kind of pushed back. They may well have been talking about different things. They weren't necessarily. It wasn't necessarily a complete disagreement, but like Tertullian wrote, what indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? What between heretics and Christians? Our instructions comes from the porch of Solomon, who had himself taught that the Lord should be taught in simplicity of heart, away with all attempts to produce a modeled Christianity of Stoic, Platonic, and dialectic composition. So that's pretty strong. There doesn't need to be any mixing of these philosophy with Christianity, and that's especially within the more conservative cultures. That's more the line you'd hear. But it's not necessarily. It doesn't say that he was pushing back directly. I feel. Well, I should go with some more quotes. Like Clement of Alexandria had some writings that before the advent of the Lord, philosophy was necessary to the Greeks for righteousness. Just sort of scattered quotes here. It was like a preparatory training ground to those who attain to faith through demonstration. For God is the cause of all things, but of some primarily as of the Old and New Testament, and others by consequence as philosophy. Perchance, too, philosophy was given to the Greeks directly and primary until the Lord should call the Greeks. And so he compares it like, for this was a schoolmaster to bring the Hellenic mind, the Greek mind, as the law, the Hebrews to Christ. So like the Hebrews had the law to bring into Christ, the Greeks had their philosophers. So. And he quotes Solomon about defending wisdom, and he says, the way of truth is one, like there's a single truth. But into it, as into a perennial river, streams flow from all sides. Interesting stuff. I don't think that Tertullian and Plato and Justin Martyr were necessarily, I think they were disagreeing to a point. But they may have been talking about certain things, as in sort of the ultimate reality would be that as described by Christ in Christianity. But these other philosophies could be pointing in that direction, is a way that makes sense that you could kind of deal with these seemingly different opinions. But anyway, that being what it was, the influential, at minimum, the influential Christians were very aware of the Greek philosophers, even if just to disagree with them, and they all did disagree with them to some extent. It was more of how useful they may have been, or how just sort of moving through history. There was a Christian by the name of John Philoponus, if I'm pronouncing that right, living in about the 500s. He wrote extensively on astronomy and physics, and he challenged a number of Aristotle's ideas. Such as the eternality of the world. Apparently Aristotle taught that the world was eternal, so he pushed back against that. The substance of the stars and planets. So you may have heard about the idea of the elements. To the ancients, there were was it 4 elements: earth, air, fire, water, and that was the substance of the earth up to the moon, like the sublunar area. But from the moon beyond, they called that was composed of a different perfect element, the 5th element, like the quintessential element. That's where the quintessential, the perfect element. And anyway, this Christian, this John, he pushed back against that and said, no, it's all created, like all of nature is created. There's nothing really divine or perfect about the stars versus the earth. It's all part of creation, and that it's all that none of it is divine, but that it was created by God and ordered by God-given laws. This same John also wrote some things on the Trinity that the church didn't quite agree with, and so those writings were condemned, and so by extension, his other writings on science were not read as widely as they may have been otherwise. But still, he was drawing on the biblical worldview to provide a framework to learn about nature. And a lot of these texts about nature, these philosophers, these Christian writers, the early ones, they were pretty much all in Greek. And the Western Church, at some point, let me see, I'm sure Stephen could tell me about when, but they switched to Latin. And when they switched to Latin, and the educated people switched to Latin, not all the Greek texts were translated to Latin, so they just lost access to some of these Greek texts. And it does seem that maybe because of that, for some other reasons, there wasn't a lot added to the knowledge of nature in the period after the switch from Greek to Latin. Possibly again because some of it was sort of lost in translation. There was a number of the Greek texts were translated into Arabic. Stephen and I had a bit of discussion about who did the translating. I'm not quite sure if it was Arabic or Muslim scholars or Christian scholars, but they were translated into Arabic and Islam. There were a number of advances made by Islamic scholars who again would have held to the basic view of the Abrahamic faith that there's an almighty God creating heaven and earth, as in the sun is not a god, the moon is not a god, these are things that were created by an almighty God. There's just a number of sort of things that happen throughout history that influence the spread of ideas, the spread of the study of nature. There's like the cities in Spain that were governed by Islamic governments that fell to Christianity, and then some of the scholars started to work at translating the books, the Greek books that had been translated into Arabic, translate them from Arabic into Latin. I understand there's a number of Greek works that the only reason we have access to them is because at some point they were translated into Arabic and then from there back into Latin. And this would have been, about the year 1000, 1100, and by the 1200 there were centers of learning were being established, like the University of Paris and Oxford and Cambridge and so on. There was a number of scientists were often, the study of God and the study of nature wasn't really separated that strongly. There was a Christian bishop, Roger Grosseteste. There was a Roger Bacon. And there was a number of just other things that influenced the general academic output in Europe, like the bubonic plague. But then other things, it seemed whenever there was sort of a mixing of ideas, people were sort of, a mixing of ideas, and people, the existing way of how people thought things might have worked might have been a little challenged, and so they had to think deeply about these things, and that led to sort of the productivity. So with the fall of the Byzantine Empire, with the capture of Constantinople by the Muslims, a lot of the Greek scholars from Constantinople, or Greek-speaking scholars, a lot of them moved through Europe and brought with them a lot of writings. Of course, the invention of the printing press led to a huge expansion in how available a lot of these works were. And this would have been, the 1400s. That's the era of scientists such as, like Galileo and Copernicus, who were influential with astronomy. And even the Protestant Reformation is credited with changing the way people thought. And one of the ways is that it encouraged people to sort of seek truth for themselves a bit more. Read your own Bible, come to your own conclusion. To a fault, actually, but it seemed to influence the study of nature as well. Don't just accept what Aristotle or Plato said. Like go out and look at nature, try and figure it out for yourself. And Reformation times shortly after. There's just a whole list of sort of very influential early scientists. Lists. You definitely don't have to memorize it, but if any of this rings a bell, like Kepler, Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, Newton, Pascal. In the sciences, we have these physical constants and these laws that are named after these people. Boyle's law. The unit of pressure, like gas pressure, is named pascals. You can measure, instead of psi, it can be so many pascals. Anyway. But what all these, so there's a lot of different people, but what these pretty much all had in common is that they believed in the basics. They just took for granted the basics of the Abrahamic faiths. Again, that there's an all-powerful, law-giving, orderly God had created the heavens and the earth. That was their basic assumption. It wasn't, they had some, it's not to say that they were all like Orthodox Christians. Some of them had strange ideas about the nature of Jesus and so on and so forth. But the core basics of Almighty God creating heaven and earth, that was just taken for granted. Of course that's how it was. And science continued on. Many other scientists up through to the present day, the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. There definitely was a move starting already in the 1700s, some, but really gaining speed in the 1800s through the 1900s of sort of moving away from explicitly being Christian and scientists. There were a lot more secular scientists. But they still sort of took for granted the basic framework of science that had been established by those earlier Christians and Jews and Muslims, the other people, the earlier scientists. So what is it about the Abrahamic faiths that provides the framework? And this is, I'm quoting Wagner and Briggs. They use this symbolism of like a slipstream for science to develop. Personally, I love to cycle. I bicycle all over the place. And if you're not familiar with like road cycling, the idea of you having someone in the front to break the wind, and then everyone else can just ride behind in the slipstream, and it's much easier. So that's the image that they use. That the Abrahamic faiths provided sort of this space that then allowed science to just develop. And so here I'm just going to, so what is it about this framework? And here I'm just quoting from like Piercy and Thaxton in their book, where they say, biblical religion gave to Western culture several of its fundamental assumptions about the natural world. And they, some of them that they list are just sort of things that seem so obvious to us, but like nature is real. Some faiths, they say that apparently some branches of Hinduism would teach that the sensory world is Maya or illusion. The spiritual world is real, but the physical world is illusion. And also, God made it good. So the material world has value. Manual work has value. Like some of the Greek philosophers would have said, it is only purely through philosophy that you could arrive at a truth. You would never do an experiment, because an experiment involved work, and work was something only slaves did. The enlightened people would just philosophize. And so God made it good. The material world is worthy of study. A rational God, an orderly world. So even if something appears totally chaotic, there's an assumption that if it was created by a rational God, there's probably some rationality, some logic behind the chaos, even if it appears chaotic. And so with that, if you assume there's a rational, sort of a logic behind the seemingly chaos of nature, you will then go look for that rationality. And you have to assume it's there before you go looking for it, or otherwise you would never even bother to look. Follow the law. So they say like the idea of a natural law, we call the laws of nature. The idea of laws themselves was not derived from observations. It was derived prior to the observations from belief in a biblical God. So they're not saying that based on the biblical God you came up with the laws of nature that we came up with, but rather the ideas of a biblical God said that there should be laws of nature out there, and then through observation and experimentation, they figured out what those laws would have been. Wagner and Briggs come up with a very similar list. They word it a little bit differently, but they say, following the strongest effects of that slipstream has revealed a number of features, and that slipstream, they mean like the Abrahamic faiths, including some influence from Greek philosophy, has revealed a number of features in the configuration, they use all these big words, but of that metaphysical curiosity which seems to have contributed to its strength or otherwise. So, The idea of a single beneficent rational agency whose rationality could be both expressed in mathematics and read in the humblest aspect of creation. So that would be fulfilled by the Creator God. A key one, the idea that this agency could not be identified with anything within the universe, but gave the whole a law-like character. God is not part of the universe. It's not like the sun is a god, or the tree is a god, or the whatever, the ocean is God, or whatever it is. It's God is outside of that, but gives that creation a law-like character. They mentioned that the idea that truth is not the exclusive property of any single civilization. That might not be entirely intuitive, but it is supported by history. It's not the study of the natural world was not just a single people. It was a mixture of. It was still the Western world, but it was different cultures, certainly. And they mentioned the idea that truth could not be imposed by force, but involved the right and even the duty of individual investigation and experiment. So you had to investigate, you had to experiment. So that's sort of the summary of this part of my talk. I would say it emerged from influences of Greek philosophy along with the Abrahamic faith, and certainly from the Middle Ages onward, modern science just largely grew out of the soil of a Christian worldview. And that's the historical context that I'd like you to come away with in this talk. And I think it's the context you should have whenever you hear about these supposed conflicts between science and faith. And it's not just that science happened to coexist with Christianity. It's that there's just really strong evidence that Christianity provided precisely the framework needed and the crucial assumptions for science to prosper. It's not just by accident. I do want to stress that this is not proof, kind of like Stephen said about knowing something absolutely. This isn't absolute proof that science couldn't have arisen somewhere else in some other worldview. It's just pointing out that science did indeed arise very naturally from a Christian worldview. It just grew out of that. So this does, to some extent, it might sort of beg a question. So does science need a Christian or similar worldview in order to thrive? And this is sort of obviously an important question, given that most of the scientific community today is somewhat agnostic. They're agnostic. Maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. Who cares? Kind of attitude. Not all, but certainly not all. But I'd say it's the majority. So will science continue to thrive without the Christian worldview? And it's not a completely easy question because it involves predicting the future, and that's sort of notoriously hard to do. Like Piercy and Thaxton, they don't make a too strong prediction either, but they just point out that without a rational basis for a lot of the assumptions of science, it is kind of an open question how long it can survive. There's a Jewish scholar and writer named Will Herberg who wrote, I think back in 1952 or 1951, he's credited with coming up with the phrase that we live in a cut flower culture. The idea that our culture has been cut off from the sort of the Christian or the faith in which it grew. The flowers are still there. Most of the assumptions are still there. The society still has many Christian sensibilities, but it's been cut off. And so the obvious implication is eventually it will wilt and die with it, being cut off. Just to reinforce one of my my main points. Modern science grew out of a monotheistic, Abrahamic worldview, and the evidence is quite strong. This wasn't just by chance. It was because this worldview precisely provided the assumptions that science needed to flourish. I have some follow-up. I have some ideas that then extend on this idea. But why don't I open it up now for questions, comments, feedback, so on. So, Truman, you're going to have a microphone, or okay? Yeah, just go ahead. Go ahead, John.
What do you say to those who say the church actually hindered science? They challenged Galileo. They'll bring up these, that science was really severely retarded at certain points because of the church.
Right. You have to acknowledge that the church made its mistakes, but it's kind of a paradox. Science would never have gotten there had it not been for the church. So it both provided the framework for it to grow, and then also tried to intervene in ways that weren't always helpful. So to just say that science was this separate thing, and the church was this thing, and the two were clashing is not supported by evidence. I don't think. I mean, it just doesn't make sense historically. Science arose because of the assumptions that the church provided, and then there was some back and forth.
Yeah. Was it a situation where the church had philosophical positions that were not based on actual factual verification?
I know Stephen and I have talked about that some. It could have been to some extent. I mean, the church, some of the scholastics had tried to merge, Christianity with Aristotelian, with Aristotle's thoughts, and so there was definitely some of that. It was also just a lot of hotheads and people with a lot of strong opinions and not willing to be polite, and a lot of power struggle. There was a lot of things going on because, like, Galileo really butted heads with the one pope. And he kind of, kept his head down to keep it from getting chopped off, type of thing. And then there was a new pope, and then he got along much better with the new pope. And so there was personality stuff going on there. I'm not sure what all. I'm not the expert on that, but from what I've read, yeah. There's a question over here.
Well, I was just basically going to say what John did. I read about that recently. I think one of the reasons they opposed Galileo was because they already had commitments to Aristotle. It was more their commitment to Aristotle than it was their commitment to Scripture or whatever. There was, you could say, it was more of a conflict between Aristotle's students and Galileo rather than the church.
That could have been, the conflict, yeah. So one of the interesting things, again, stressing just how important your worldview is in sort of dictating or influencing which scientific or which theory of nature you're going to accept. So it was in one of these books that I read that talked about, I forget which faith or which philosophy, but there's some, I think it's a little more Egyptian, where they worship the sun, where they consider the sun to be sort of holy. And those people fairly readily accepted the idea that the sun is the center of the solar system, because it would just make sense. If the sun is holy, everything revolves around that. It wasn't that they had scientific evidence for it. It wasn't, they just, observed these stars, the little movements. It didn't make more sense scientifically. It made more sense to them philosophically. So the philosophical assumptions do have super strong implications. They sort of set what is acceptable and what is not acceptable as an answer for your explanation of nature. I don't know if that helped any. Yeah. Anyway. Yes.
So was the promotion of science happening all throughout the Dark Ages, or did it was there something different about, the Reformation Enlightenment period where it flourished more than during the Dark Ages? Or was it just a group of elite that were in that and everybody else was in the dark?
Yeah, I mean, Stephen could answer that better than I could. It was, the Dark Ages were not half as dark as the later scholars tried to make it seem. So the idea of the Dark Ages really arose out of the Enlightenment, with a lot of these deistic scholars who tried to draw a line between the wise philosophers of Greece and Rome, and then there's a little dark area in between, and then themselves. They are the successors of these enlightened philosophers, and they had to kind of dismiss the period in between. And now it is true that there wasn't near as much progress or as much things added to the general knowledge of nature over that time, But there's many things. I mean, the fall of the Roman Empire, people just trying to stay alive instead of having time to do the luxury of research, and just things like the printing press had a huge influence on the dissemination of knowledge and people being exposed to all these ideas. So that's my incomplete answer. Yeah, again, I'm sure Stephen, he's much more of a historian than I could, so he could answer that better. Sorry, yeah.
So you mentioned how science was kind of founded in the Christian worldview, Abrahamic faith, and how today the scientific community is a lot more agnostic as a whole.
Sure.
So I guess kind of a few questions related to that. Why do you think that's the case? And then secondly, am I understanding correctly that a lot of today's conservative Christians are skeptical of science, at least and why don't we see more conservative Christians involved in scientific fields if it's like studying what God has created?
Yeah, good points. Let me see, take them one by one. The first one was why there's more why so many scientists are agnostic, and that's a complicated question. My current opinion on that, again, I'm sure Stephen have maybe a better view, but the church, especially the Catholic Church, was often very, very dogmatic. This is the proper way of thinking, period. Other people are heretics. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but they were very dogmatic. And so some of the more free thinkers couldn't do their thinking within the church. And so they kind of, it seemed they kind of rejected, it varied. Some people just did their free thinking in private, just to kind of, there's some quotes about, basically to save your life, you don't talk about it, but you do your thinking in private or something like that. And so I think there was some reaction, some really strong reaction against some actually very real abuses of power by the church. That's the first thing. I mean, if you read some of the works, some of the things that people in the sort of the elite of society wrote in the 1700s into the 1800s, really even maybe starting in the 1600s, but it wasn't just that they disagree with Christianity. They were extremely hostile against it. They hated it. And that didn't come from nowhere. I mean, I think this is actually getting into what I'm going to talk about in my next talk, but the church abused its authority, and people rebelled against that. And so some of that fed into it, and some of there's a scientist, philosopher, writer called Spinoza, and he was a Jew. His ancestors were forced by the Catholic Church to forcibly convert to Christianity, like under the threat of death or deportation or whatever. And some of those experiences had to feed into the later rejection of the faith. I can't imagine that it didn't feed into that. Actually, Stephen and I were just discussing this, I think, last night or this morning. It wasn't really until, well, it was somewhat, but the idea of more agnosticism and atheism in science really, really sort of gathered speed in the late 1800s and then through the 1900s. It was sort of a slow accumulation. I don't know. That's an incomplete answer again. And then the second question was,
to me, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like there's a lot of skepticism towards science among today's Christians.
right.
And if science is simply the study of God's magnificent creation,
Right. Yeah. So I think a lot of the scientists from hundreds of years ago were very faithful Christians, but for many, especially the conservative Christians, if you read and you hear the direct and vicious attacks on the faith by some of the scientific community, including some rather influential people. We were just discussing, Stephen and I, about Andrew White, who was the first president of Cornell University, and he wrote a 2-volume book on the what's it called, the conflict, like the conflict between science and religion, or the warfare between science and religion. So when you have influential people in science just really harshly attacking religion, then there's a counter reaction against that. So those people are bad, those people are evil, they're on the side of the devil, we don't want anything to do with them, kind of type of thing. And so you end up with this situation where you toss the baby out with the bathwater. There are conservative Christian scientists, for sure, but yeah, it's not the majority. I'm hoping that if more people understand the development of science, sort of within a Christian worldview, or at least Abrahamic worldview, and understand that there really is not only is there no fundamental difference, but it's they actually very naturally fit together. The one fed the other. That more conservative Christians would be scientists. And I think part of that is to not react negatively against all the attacks. It's to understand that we as the church, and it's not just, I mean, even those of us who are Anabaptists carry some responsibility. There's the abuses that the church has done, abuses of power, abuses of many of them abuses of power. Even within the Anabaptist church, you might say, okay, so we're not involved with government or the military, so we're not involved with those abuses. We still have abuses of power. I mean, what's the reason of all the many church splits if it's not power struggles? You know, I mean, there's other reasons too, but we all struggle with dealing with power wisely, and facing up that some of our mistakes have fed into atheism, because so many of the prominent atheists are reacting against the abuses that we have done. I think is part of the process in sort of understanding what happened, taking responsibility for it, and then sort of moving forward, and to be scientists, study nature with the method that's based in the Abrahamic worldview. Yeah, I mean, hopefully that made some sense.
You say that scientific advancement springs out of the Judeo-Christian worldview. I think that you're saying that scientific advancement is a good thing.
And that's, yeah, a good point.
It's going to take me a couple of examples to develop this, but I know that scientific advancement, like the most obvious effect it has on me is my personal comfort, other than if I'm in a controlled house and I don't have to have two things. So that's really nice. But if you look at what science does, it delivers people from cancer so they can die of Alzheimer's. And it takes babies that would die at 30 weeks and saves them so that they can now fight their lives at 24 weeks, and then pretty soon they're fighting their lives at 22 weeks. And so that's one side of it, that's like a medical concern. And then on the other side, people get liberated from their little farm so they can go work 14 hours in the factory a day for the Industrial Revolution. So I guess my question is, how do you defend the thesis that scientific advancement is a good thing?
The core would be that it tells us things that are true about the natural world, and truth is a good thing. And these are truths about the natural world. It's the idea that knowledge is preferable to ignorance. It'd be the basis of it. Then what you do with that knowledge is a whole topic on itself, and that's my next full talk. But it's knowledge is better than ignorance. It does tell us true things about the natural world. Anyway, was there, okay, sure.
There's one other point. The question that came up about the Catholic Church restricting Galileo over that accusation. It's interesting because when atheists make that claim, they're actually refuting their own position, because it's not based on the presuppositions they should have. It shouldn't even matter, because science isn't an end in itself. Knowledge is not necessarily preferable to ignorance.
Yeah, that comes down to right, and that comes partly that comes down to the assumptions of our society, like the water we swim in, so to speak. as a society, like of course knowledge is preferable to ignorance. Kind of yeah, in a sense. I mean, you're so I think you're right, but it becomes so abstract to be almost irrelevant in the everyday lives of anybody outside of a few geeky philosophers. It's kind of my general take.
My point is that there's some abstract things we know about the universe that couldn't be, our desire and our need to know that can't be explained by evolution, because there's no evolutionary benefit in knowing that the Earth orbits the sun and not vice versa. That's why we have that drive to understand that.
And that's where your philosophical worldview plays in so strongly. So the answer for anything that cannot be explained by evolution to a committed secularist is that we just haven't figured it out yet. It will someday. We will someday figure out how evolution explains it. We just haven't figured it out yet. And so you can never get you can't prove or disprove what we will someday do. so that you always run into that loop. I mean, to some extent, we do the same thing with a lot of our faith stuff. I mean, there's things about God and heaven and so on that we don't know yet. I mean, it's maybe, but yeah. I mean, I don't think it's that much different from what people do. So there's this one, the one book that I read, the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that I thought was kind of a blast of fresh air. He argued that he argued a number of things, but he one of his arguments was that things make sense within a paradigm. He was you probably heard of the term paradigm shift, and he was the one who really popularized that term. And so he would say it's only within this framework, this paradigm, that things make sense, and that to move from one paradigm to the other involves not so much just a rational deduction as much as it's like a conversion. You convert from one paradigm to the other. And that, anyway, I don't want to go too deep into that, but the idea is you cannot appeal to truth. Like everything, all of our ways of thinking take place within a paradigm. You can only move from one to the other. You can't appeal to some ultimate truth paradigm, because even that would take place within a paradigm. So you're always within sort of this own shell. And he's one of the, not intentionally, I think, but he's one of the influencers towards the postmodernism. So if everything takes place sort of within your own opinion or within your own worldview, there's no neutral worldview from which to view all other worldviews, so to speak. And so therefore there is no such thing as absolute truth, and so on, like in that direction, which is the logical outcome. Is the logical outcome of that way of thinking. It actually makes sense. So from a purely philosophical worldview, like not invoking, well, I should say purely philosophical, but from sort of a natural atheistic worldview, you naturally end up with like postmodernism.
Where there's no absolute.
Right, and so the idea is that just through rational thought alone, you can't really rationalize your outside of these boxes, so to speak. You're always, The idea is that once you sort of make the assumption, or you might almost say the faith in a say a Christian worldview, then the other things start to make sense. It was G.K. Chesterton who said that God is like the sun. You can't directly look at him, but you would G.K. Chesterton, by the light of the sun, everything else makes sense, or everything else becomes clear. Something to that extent. I don't know. Did I run down a totally different path? And not completely, a little bit. Okay. I've been talking for a long time. This doesn't take super long. So is John's question about some of the creationist arguments? If they're not, let me see. What was the?
If there are desperate efforts to make their point, doesn't defeat their purpose.
Right. If their desperate efforts to make their point doesn't defeat their purpose. Yes, and that is precisely my point in this last part. So it's just some practical consequences of the observation that these monotheistic and Abrahamic worldviews provide the necessary assumptions for science to flourish. So one of them is that there's this argument like argument from design, or something. I mean, you might say argument to design, which basically says that if you look at nature, you see all this order in nature, and therefore there must have been a creator of it. It's just important to know that that's not the way that it worked historically. People did not look at nature. I mean, arguably some of the Greek philosophers, but predominantly they did not look at nature, see everything be perfectly orderly, and then deduce an orderly God. They believed in an orderly God, and then they looked for the order in nature and found an order in nature. So the two ideas are connected, an orderly creator and an orderly nature. But historically, it moved from orderly God first to orderly nature, not the other way around. Now people are trying to argue the other way around. And it's not necessarily a bad argument, but I think it's important to realize it's the reverse of how it historically happened. Another form of sometimes the form of the argument is the assertion that science supports the Bible. Okay, but the way it worked historically is that it wasn't that science supported the Bible, it was that the Bible provided the framework for science to flourish. It was the other way around. And it's just sort of a brief warning about arguments for God or for the reliability of the Bible. And I'm interested in your feedback on this take here, but I think it's often very tempting to take the bait to a challenge to say, prove that God exists. And okay, so someone is asking us to prove it, so we need to prove it. And we could come up with a proof of sorts. But I do think we could easily end up undermining our own point and talking nonsense, really. And it has to do with the way it seems to me, the way a proof or a test works. I do think a test has to have more authority than the thing being tested. I think it has to be that way, or the test wouldn't be reliable. So my little example here is, if I could ask you all to sort of, what is your body temperature? And you could all come up with some number. But if we take a thermometer, a very well-calibrated thermometer, and take your body temperature, and if your number and the thermometer's number are different, we'd assume the thermometer is right. Because the test has more authority than the thing being tested. And so you might see the problem when it comes to God. If we're trying to come up, at least the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible is portrayed as the sort of the highest possible authority, the one who created everything else. So it's the idea that God is the creator of nature, and this has been the subject of some philosophical debate, but if he's the creator of nature, it seems he will be the creator of the laws of nature as well. And so he's not subject to those same laws of nature. And I think there can be, so you can't use the laws of nature to prove God, because the laws of nature are subject to God, not the other way around. And I think there's a similar argument is made in the book of Hebrews, where the author is making, I think, similar arguments with regards to swearing an oath. It's Hebrews chapter 6, where he says that because God could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself. So there's no higher authority to appeal to sort of prove God. God is the highest authority. And so I think we got to be careful that if we have a proof for God, we could end up proving a small g God that is inferior to the authority of the proof. So you have this ultimate authority, this proof that proves this lesser authority, this thing we're calling God. And that would not be the God of the Bible, whatever it would be. Now, with that said, I think there is lots and lots of good evidence of God, as in lots of signs pointing in God's direction. And that would be a whole separate talk. I just don't think there's logical proofs where you could force someone to accept that God exists. There's no higher authority to appeal to prove God. So that's basically what I have with with sort of the warning.
So how would you talk to these people?
I usually don't talk about God to these people, but no. Usually, if I talk about these types of subjects, you have to find some common ground, like interest. For me, if someone just isn't interested in talking, I I don't force it. I don't, like.
You have a billboard that says there's evidence for God.
Oh, evidence. Yeah, evidence is not proof. So part of the problem is science has different definitions for the same word that general society has. So proof in science is absolute. It's like math. Proof in society is often more like the proof beyond reasonable doubt, which you run into all kinds of problems with the differences in the definitions. So a scientist might say you can never prove God. That's what I would say. You can never prove it. To a person who's not a scientist, that would mean, oh, therefore there's no evidence for it. That's not at all. That's all not at all what I'd be talking about. So evidence to me is like the signs that point towards a God. So it's the things like, even just the things like beauty, like the fall beauty. It's pointing in the direction of something bigger than itself. There's something, yeah. Right, and you could use that. You could use that for everything. I mean, you could, like, that's just a natural phenomena. Like, there's no way to absolutely disprove that, because even the things where you say, well, how do you explain this? And even if there is no explanation, again, they'll just go back to, well, we just haven't figured it out yet. And so you can never you can use that to escape any argument. That's really the conclusion. Yeah, I mean, broadly for this part of the talk, I try to present evidence that modern science rose out of a monotheistic and largely Abrahamic worldview, and that this is not just by chance, but it was precisely this worldview that allowed science to flourish. And yeah, then the next main talk is just as a transition is okay. So if we have this knowledge, what do we do with it? What should we do with it? And that's more the ethics of it, and so what's the basis for the ethics that to determine what we should do with this knowledge that is provided by science?